Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we will be discussing the stylings of the ancient Greeks. Greece was incredibly influential. Many elements of Greek design can still be seen in buildings today, as their sophisticated style would become the norm for buildings in Western societies. Additionally, the Greeks were a very advanced group of people. They made great strides in fields such as philosophy, art, and government. In this lecture, you will learn about the geography and people of Greece, as well as the stylistic elements they made popular. On this slide, you can see a map of ancient Greece. So Greece comprises of a large peninsula extending south towards the Mediterranean. It has a lot of islands, as you can see on the map, and it sits between the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea. So, as you can see, Greece has a really extensive coastline that has a lot of bays and inlets, which gave them a lot of fertile land and sunshine and rain. However, it also had a very exposed geography, which, while being great for trade, also made it prone to invasions, so it wasn't great for protection. And the geography of Greece had a profound effect on the culture of the nation, which is why it's important to understand this map. As you can see, it was a lot of city-states rather than being necessarily one cohesive place, which is why all of the islands have a profound effect on the way that Greece as a country ran. So, as mentioned on the last slide, Greece is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea on the south. And if you'll recall back to our last lecture on Egypt, Egypt is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea on the north. So this fostered a lot of trade between the two nations. As we continue, you'll notice that there was a lot of influence, a lot of similarities in the style. However, Greece is going to be a lot more influenced by Egypt than Egypt was by Greece. So you're going to see a lot of the same styles that we talked about last time reinterpreted into the Greek style. And then just to reiterate, they were located in a part of the world that has a lot of rainfall. So unlike Egypt, this one is not arid. It actually has a lot of water available to them, which led to abundant foliage. So wood is not going to be scarce here. You're going to have plenty of that, and we'll see that as we discuss their furniture. In terms of natural resources, the geography of Greece really helped it succeed. So it was a very mountainous region, which provided a lot of the marble that Greece is known for. However, that mountainous topography did isolate the city-states, so there was a lot of tension between neighboring communities. The Greeks weren't always friendly with each other. However, they were surrounded by water, which once again promoted that seafaring and trade. So even though they were prone to invasion and they were in constant conflict with one another, they did have access to outside influences. And then that coastline, once again, just to reiterate, had many bays and inlets and provided a lot of fertile soil, so they were able to grow their own resources. As a people, the Greeks were incredibly advanced. This had much to do with their style of government. Greece was the birthplace of democracy and considered public life to be central to their lifestyle. As the birthplace of democracy, the Greek government has been one of the most influential in history. However, while elements of the Grecian government were great, it was not great for all people. Greece was still a pretty misogynistic society, which meant women and slaves were not included in the democratic process and were not allowed to vote. Still, the Greeks reached the height of accomplishment in many areas, such as philosophy, ethics, politics, and fine arts. And this happened because the Greeks were a particularly proud group of people. They were convinced that they were the superior warriors, the superior philosophers and artists and mathematicians and writers. And you can see on this screen a lot of those notable people, many of whom we still study in classrooms today. The first duty of every Greek citizen was to the state, so whichever isolated city-state they were in, they were completely loyal to that, which meant that there was actually a lot of equality, so extremes of wealth and poverty were not tolerated, and wealth was seldom shown. All of those funds were intended to glorify the gods rather than glorifying individual citizens. So, like I said, while it wasn't necessarily great for women and slaves, it was a pretty good place of the world to be in terms of their government style. They all had a centralized focus. Everyone knew that their duty was to the state that they lived in, and they made that really central to their lifestyle. And they wanted to be the best at what they did, whichever area they were pursuing. The Greek religion is quite elaborate, and many scholars still devote themselves to studying these myths today. The Greek religion was polytheistic, like the Egyptian religion, which meant that there were many gods. On this slide, you can see a partial list of the gods, so this was not all of them. It was a much more elaborate religion than that. The religion was founded on the worship of nature, so each god was associated with a force of nature. Once again, I would like to reiterate this is a partial list. So there were 3 gods that were deemed to be greater than the others, and those were Zeus, Athena, and Apollo. So Zeus was the supreme god, the most important, and he was associated with the earth and heaven. But while he was the supreme god, it is important to note that he was not a creator figure for this religion. So there were actually several gods who came before him. So despite the fact that he was the most powerful, unlike in many of the other religions that you will notice we will study throughout this class, he was not in the role of creator. Then you have Athena. She was the goddess of wisdom and war, and Apollo, who was the god of the sun, but also of light and music and poetry. One aspect of the Greek religion that is quite unique to them is how human the Greek divinities were. So the Greeks admired humanity, and they wanted a life that was really focused on the life you're living now rather than aspiring to some afterlife. So, since they admired humanity so much, their gods were created in the image of people rather than the mysterious and supernatural gods of other religions. For every great quality that each of these gods had, they also had their downfalls. They tended to experience real human emotions such as anger and lust and greed, and this can be seen throughout all of the myths that the Greeks made quite popular. So none of these figures was a perfect ideal of morality, which once again is very different than the gods of many other religions. And finally, the Greeks honored their deities with shrines and temples, which were appropriately scaled. They were incredibly fancy, but not in the way that Giza, so those pyramids that we talked about in our Egypt lecture, or Babylon would be. So while still being quite elaborate, they did believe that there was a certain decorum of modesty towards their buildings. To wrap up our discussion on the people of Greece, it's important to reiterate that they were a very idealistic group of people. They idealized individualism and encouraged advancements in philosophical thought. This can also be seen in their development of an early form of democracy. Additionally, the Greeks were a relatively peaceful group of people in day-to-day life. However, they were also known for their warring between the states. In fact, one of the most infamous wars, the Peloponnesian War, was fought between Sparta and Troy in ancient Greece. Lastly, they were a very athletic group of people. They developed the first Olympics with various events to show athletic might. This was also a means to celebrate the human form and body, as their focus was not on an afterlife but on the current life, so the Greeks had a high regard for physical physique. Looking at a timeline of Greece, art and architectural development were actually quite steady throughout the entirety of the empire. However, scholars divide the development into 3 formative periods: the geometric, the orientalizing, and the archaic, followed by three mature periods: the Classical, the 4th century, and the Hellenistic. The geometric period marks the earliest stage of Greek art. So the decoration was highly abstract and angular. It was also schematic, so you had series of lines and geometric shapes. There wasn't a focus on recession into space or realism in any form or fashion. And during this period, the first Olympic Games were initiated towards the end of the period as a means of honoring Zeus. And Greeks consider this to be the true beginning of their civilization. So that single event marks the time in which Greeks really gathered around their collective history and became like a single society. In the Orientalizing period, you began to see some influence from the ancient Near East. So representations began to become a little bit more lifelike, though they were still pretty stylized. And you had the introduction of arabesque and floral decoration. Furthermore, the Greeks began to import luxury goods such as spices and perfumes and textiles and metals. But more so than just goods, they also imported ideas. So they imported their alphabet, astronomy, and mythology, which Greece would become quite known for. And they were mainly influenced by Persia, but this period was also quite influenced by Egypt. So there was a lot of travel between the different nations around Greece that allowed them to pull in ideas and goods and be heavily influenced by the world around them. The Archaic period was a bit of a fraught time in terms of Greek history. It was during the Persian Wars. However, you did see the flourishing of vase painting and sculpting, which the Greeks would become quite known for. During the Archaic period, they were still heavily influenced by Egyptian style, but they were also beginning to formulate a style that was very distinctively their own. The Greek architectural style we will continue to see not just in this lecture, but as we continue throughout the course. And so they began to construct large buildings and develop all of their own orders. None of these orders were fully fledged yet, but they were beginning to build large limestone and stucco temples. So the Archaic period really marks the beginning of the Greek style. The three mature periods followed the three formative periods, and during the three mature periods, art was becoming more sophisticated, but it was also remarkably consistent. So everything that had developed in those three formative periods kind of plateaued, and we get a really long and consistent and sustained idea of the Greek style. However, the pinnacle of Greek art was generally thought to be in this first mature period, which was the Classical period. So the Classical period marks the greatest achievement in ancient Greece. It takes place in the time between Greece's victory in the Persian Wars and Athens' defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And then the city of Athens was at its height of artistic and intellectual glory. So you had Sophocles and Euripides as dramatists. You had a lot of famous historians and philosophers like Socrates making leaps and bounds during this classical period. Additionally, the Doric and Ionic orders, which once again we will discuss later, were perfected during this classical period. Doric monuments were built, including the Parthenon being built once again during this classical period. And then Ionic temples were also being built across the nation of Greece. So during the 4th century, this follows Athens being defeated and continues on through the death of Alexander the Great. So this is also known as the late classical period, and some famous individuals include Plato and Aristotle and Hippocrates. The first two were philosophers, and Hippocrates was known for medical advancements. Um, and then the Corinthian order began to be used during this 4th century period, but it never rivaled the Doric and Ionic orders in popularity. Lastly, we have the Hellenistic period, which shows the effects of Alexander's conquest as they began to really spread the influence of Greece. So Greece influence spread all over the ancient Near East and far into Asia. And then they had new centers that were beyond just that little map of Greece that we saw, so going into Pergamon, Rhodes, and Alexandria. Additionally, during the Hellenistic period, there were lots of advancements in mathematics and science, but literature began to become ponderous, so it began to die off during this time. Architecture became too complicated and started to stray away from that very simplistic and ordered Greek style, and many believe that art became too sentimental. However, many of the masterpieces that we know today date back to this Hellenistic period. So think of the Venus de Milo, which is an incredibly famous statue. Lots of these antiquity pieces of Greece we know from this Hellenistic period. Moving on to the architecture of Greece, it's important to note that their architecture was very functional. So every different feature had a very practical purpose. While we often think of Greek architecture as these really elaborate buildings, the truth of the matter is that each thing was there for a reason, and they didn't want any of the structure of the building to be overshadowed by decoration. So while they did have a lot of decoration, it was meant to serve a purpose, and it was supposed to enhance the actual structure of the architecture as opposed to making its own statement. As we all know, Greece was known for its achievements in stone. Being next to the mountains, they had lots of resources of natural marble, which is what most of their buildings were constructed out of. So not only is this a strong stone, but it's actually a relatively soft stone, which meant that they were able to use it for decorative purposes as well as structural purposes, because it's a very easy stone to carve. And then the evidence shows that these Greek buildings were brightly painted. This is a process known as polychroming, and we will get into that a little bit later, but just know that as we see them today was not how these buildings technically existed. They would have actually been incredibly brightly colored, as opposed to the white figures that we see today. The Greeks would develop several new systems when they were constructing their buildings, one of which is the truss roof system, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. But the most important aspect of this to note is that it was intended to help them cope with rainfall. So this was not something that the Egyptians would have needed because their climate was much more arid. But the Greeks being on that coast and kind of in that tropical range, they did see a lot more rainfall and had to learn how to cope with that so that the rainfall wasn't sitting on the tops of their buildings. Additionally, they used the native marble for the building materials. So like I just mentioned on the last slide, they were located next to the mountains, which gave them great deposits of natural marble to work with, and they did use this for most of their buildings. And then they also developed the first 3 architectural orders known as the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. We will discuss each of these in detail later, but they are probably the most important thing that you can learn in this lecture, because they're going to keep coming back throughout history. They are revived time and time again, so they are incredibly influential. So continuing our discussion on the truss system, once again, this was intended to move the rainwater off the roofs. So in comparison to the Egyptians who had the flat roofs because they wanted to hold as much water as they could, the Greeks needed to be able to get that off of their roofs. So they came up with a gable design, which is what we draw when we think of a house today, right? So you have that triangular roof, which allows the rainfall to be swept off of it. It doesn't sit on top. And this creates a pediment on the building facade. The pediment is just going to be the triangular area, and they would embellish that with a lot of carvings. This slide shows an image of the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, which is home to the Parthenon. So Acropolis means high point in the city, so each Greek city-state would have had their own version. However, this one in Athens is the most famous. Many people still visit it today. Some acropolises were used for defensive purposes, but the Parthenon was used solely for religious purposes. It was a temple to Athena and housed an elaborate statue of her in the center. In this image, you can see that the Parthenon is peripteral, which means it's surrounded by columns on all sides. The floor plan has 2 rooms and features highly decorated walls, but remember, none of these decorations would have existed without purpose, so they were meant to honor Athena and bring her more glory. And many believe that probably never in history has greater thought been devoted to the design of one singular building. So this slide here just has some additional notes on the Parthenon. Once again, I'd like to reiterate, this was a temple first and foremost, and it was built to the goddess Athena. She served as the patron god, if you will, for the city of Athens, which is where this is located. So she was their most popular god. She was the one that represented who they were as a city-state, similar to the way that Apollo would have represented Delphi. And there was a statue of Athena seated at the center of the temple. And one thing to note is that these weren't really the kind of temples that city citizens would have walked through necessarily. They were more there as a means of being a home away from Olympus for the gods. So they believed that the gods would actually come and stay in these places, and they didn't want people just walking through all the time. So this was really for Athena, it wasn't for the viewer. It did feature trabeated construction, which is just another way of saying that post and lintel construction. So while it was decorated differently, this is something very similar to what we saw in Egypt. It also features that trussed roof, so remember just the triangular roof. And it had a portico surrounding the outside. So portico is just what we would refer to today as a porch. And then this was done in the Doric order. Once again, we'll get into all of the orders later on, but the Doric is going to be the primary and most simplified order. And then it had a very established tympanum and frieze, which was done in high relief. So high relief means that while the sculpture was not in the round, the statue was carved deeply into the stone, which creates a lot of depth within the piece. And then additionally, the Parthenon has several visual illusions for perfection. So the architects, who were Ictinus and Callicrates, knew that the human eye cannot accurately perceive a straight line. No matter how straight the line is, our vision will always bend it somehow and curve it. So rather than building the Parthenon using those perfectly straight lines, they actually calculated the curve needed to make sure that those lines visually appear straight despite the fact that they're not actually straight. And then the friezes around the exterior and interior, known as the Great Frieze of Phidias, they have many interpretations, but they're often considered to be a depiction of a presentation to Athena, so a celebration of who she was in regards to the city. Before discussing the interior of the Parthenon, I want to take a moment to explain the art of polychroming. While this was a very popular method of decorating statues and buildings in ancient Greece, the process was largely ignored by art historians for centuries as we favored the plain white marble. However, rather than being plain and white, the Greeks often favored highly colored pieces. Everything was quite vibrant and detailed. In an article for The New Yorker, author Margaret Talbot goes into a great amount of detail regarding the often forgotten art of polychroming. She notes that many art historians have not only failed to recognize the popularity of polychroming in Greece, but have quite literally whitewashed a large portion of history by removing flecks of paint while supposedly restoring the pieces of art to their original glory. There are two main passages from this article that I think will help our understanding of polychroming. First, Talbot writes, for Abby, who is now a professor of ancient art at the University of Georgia, the idea that the ancients disdained bright color is the most common misconception about Western aesthetics in the history of Western art. It is, he said, a lie we all hold dear. And second, Talbot writes, one afternoon this summer, Marco Leona, who runs the scientific research development at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, gave me a tour of the Greek and Roman galleries. He pointed out a Greek vase from the 3rd century BCE that depicts an artist painting a statue. Leona said of polychroming, it's like the best kept secret that's not even a secret. Jan Stubbe Ostergaard, a former curator for the Nye Carlsberg Glyptotek Museum in Copenhagen, and founder of an international research network on polychromy, told me, saying you've seen these sculptures when you've seen only the white marble is comparable to somebody coming from the beach and saying they've seen a whale because there was a skeleton on the beach. On this slide, you can see an image of a Greek sculpture without the polychroming and with, and while it may be a shock to see, I think it is critically important that we understand the role of color in Greek art, as it was something that the Greeks valued quite dearly. So on this slide, you can see an image of what we believe the interior of the Parthenon would have looked like. As you can see, it does have that statue of Athena, which was quite massive. It would have been at least 2 stories tall, and it was all painted and all made out of marble. So that polychroming technique would have filled this space as well as the marble. So while we traditionally think of these spaces as being white and soft, they actually would have been filled with color and quite vibrant spaces. So the Elgin marbles are a series of 8 statues that were originally housed in the Parthenon alongside the statue of Athena. Now, one thing that's important to note about the history of these statues is that after the fall of Rome, Greece never was really able to maintain a stable central government. They were often invaded, and they switched hands quite a bit. So during the time that Greece was being ruled by the Turkish government, Lord Elgin, who was a British ambassador, persuaded the Turkish government in Athens to allow him to remove the frieze and the marbles from the Parthenon as a means of preventing further damage. Now, by persuaded, it's important to note that it was not the Greeks who gave consent for these to be taken, it was the Turkish government. And while the Greeks weren't necessarily the most able to protect these resources, that is true about the British argument here, they certainly weren't getting any help. So the British ambassador, his idea was just to take these marbles from them, and while there is technically a signature, there was no money in return for this transaction. There was no sort of help in preserving any of the other things, but they are currently on display at the British Museum of Art in London. But while these are classical sculptures, they are still a very important part of modern history. Right now, so in 2021, there is still an ongoing debate on whether or not to return these marbles to Greece now that Greece does have the proper means of displaying and taking care of these marbles. However, the British government argues that since the contract was signed, even though it wasn't signed by the Greek government as it exists today, and it was not signed with informed consent, the Brits believe that they do have the authority to hold on to these marbles. So there's lots of debate as to where these marbles should go, and there's not a real finite answer. There's not a clean solution, but it is important to note that while we think of these things as being so far in the past, they definitely do still shape the art world today. And there's definitely a lot of discussion going on about what to do with ancient statues that we currently have. Moving on to the architectural orders, these are probably the most critical things for you to understand from today's lesson. The orders defined Greek buildings, and each order was to be used for a very specific purpose in a very specific way. A classical order, either Greek or Roman, specifies the style of a column, the style of the entablature, and the details of the column and entablature, and the relationship between the component of parts to the whole assembly. The main features of the orders were the columns and the entablatures, which replicate the post and lintel system that we studied in Egypt. The entablature serves as the lintel, which sits across the top of the columns or post. These would have been highly decorated in most circumstances and make use of three main pieces: the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. We will go into more detail on each of these on future slides. One of the main features of the columns are the capitals. This is really the quickest way to determine which order is being used, as the capitals are very distinctive. Additionally, the shaft of the column would have varied based on the order being used. So while some were reeded, others were not, and vice versa. Each order has some optional features, including the base, the pedestal, and the stylobate. While these would not have been seen on every building, they were often used to enhance the structure of the building, which, as we've discussed, is the whole purpose of Greek buildings. While they were decorated, the decoration was never the focus of the Greek building, which is why these orders are so important. And then lastly, there are two types of columns that we will discuss that don't fit into any specific order but are seen throughout Greece. So these are the caryatids, which are common featuring statues of women, and Atlas columns, which feature the statue of men. On this slide, you can see the three main Greek orders. These are very basic images that I want to go through, but we will get into much more detail momentarily. But on the left, you can see the Doric order, which is the oldest and most basic order. It's very simple. It has a capital, once again, minimal detailing there, and it does not have a base. In the middle, you can see a drawing of the Ionic order. This order is a little bit more complex. As you can see, the column has evolved to have a base as well as a more detailed capital. And this capital features a volute, which is the scroll that you see across the top. As soon as you see that, you should instantly recognize that that's an Ionic capital. And then lastly, on the right, you can see a Corinthian column. These were by far the most intricate, as you can see by looking at the capital, which features the acanthus leaves. These are very detailed in their carving, and once again, this column does feature a base. One thing to note is that each of these columns are fluted, which is quite common for Greek columns, though it was not necessary and was occasionally left off. So the fluting is one of the very, very few things that is optional about these orders. Most everything else is incredibly strict. So for example, the Ionic order must have those scrolling volutes. If the column doesn't have the volutes, it cannot be an Ionic column. So on this slide, we'll dive a little bit more deeply into the history of each of these orders. So there were two principal orders, which were the Doric and the Ionic orders, and a subsidiary order, which was the Corinthian order. So the Doric and Ionic orders were developed on opposite sides of the Aegean Sea. So the Doric was developed on the west, the Ionic on the east. So that's kind of where you'll see most of those, though they would interact with each other eventually. And the guidelines on all of these orders are incredibly strict. However, no two Greek temples are exactly the same. So while these set a really finite set of guidelines for each of the buildings that was going to be built, there was a little bit of room for creativity. So starting with the Doric order, this is going to be the earliest and the most severe order, but it was also the most popular. So it does have the simplest capital, as we saw on the last slide. It never has a base. You're not going to see it with a base ever. And then it does have stockier proportions. So remember, this was developed the earliest, so they weren't making as many strides in finding more creative ways to hold up the ceiling, so they needed the most bulky and the kind of stone that was going to hold up the most amount of weight. So these columns tend to look really stocky in comparison to the Ionic or the Corinthian orders. The Parthenon is done primarily in the Doric order, though you can see a couple of Ionic columns throughout. And then it does have a fluted shaft most of the time, but it's not necessary for this order. So once again, this is the simplest order, but it is the most severe, so there's not much room for creativity. If you were building something in the Doric order, it looked a certain way, and while no two temples are exactly the same, the closest you're going to get to having two temples that look exactly the same are going to come from this Doric order. So moving on to the Ionic order, this is less architecturally limiting than the Doric order. There is a bit more room for interpretation. The columns are generally a little bit taller and a little bit more slender. They do feature a base around the bottom that just looks like your standard base molding. And then the most iconic thing about the Ionic order are those volutes that are at the top. They look like a scroll. And like I said on the last slide, that's going to be the fastest way to recognize an Ionic column because they will always, always, always feature that. And then they did usually feature a fluted shaft as well. So the Corinthian order is far more decorative than either the Doric order or the Ionic order. It was introduced in the city of Corinth. And then it appeared relatively late. So the other orders had been used for significantly longer than the Corinthian order, which is probably why it never gained the same amount of popularity that the Doric or the Ionic orders would have featured. And then it is very similar to the Ionic order. So it has that slender fluted shaft. It features the base around the bottom, but it is more decorative, so it uses the acanthus leaves around the capital. So this slide is going to be one of the most helpful for you to save, as it does break down all of the different aspects of each of the orders. So not only were they different in their use of columns, but most importantly, they were different in their use of decoration. And we saw that a little bit on the columns, which is why I suggest using the columns as a means of identifying which order you're working with at any given time. But this slide has a lot of really great detailing on the vocabulary. So you can see on the Doric order, you do have that architrave, which remember would have been decorated, sometimes left blank, but most of the time it probably would have been at least painted in some way. And then above that architrave, you have the triglyphs, which are just decorations that are basically little lines that are vertical, and they are in sets of 3, hence why they are named the triglyph. And then next to that you have the metope, which is a little blank slate Sometimes it would have like a circle or something in the middle to be decorative there, but that pattern of triglyph and metopies is very common in Greece, and you will see it throughout the rest of this course. Um, on the Ionic order, you have a really great, once again, breakdown of what the cornice, the frieze, and the architrave is in terms of the whole entablature. So remember, all three of those pieces make up the entablature. And they're really all a series of very ornate moldings, but they are three separate pieces, so it is nice to know which piece goes where and how that's going to sit on each of these orders. The Corinthian order, once again, further breaks down some of the detailing that you can see. So those dentils are quite common. You'll see them throughout Greece, as well as later on. They're a pretty common, they just look like little teeth, which is why we call them dentils. So they're really small, and it's just like a little rectangle, a blank space, a rectangle, a blank space. So they had very different types of moldings that went throughout, but most of them can actually still be seen on buildings today, which is why this slide is so important. So this slide has another example of that Ionic order, which you can tell from that volute on the top of the capital. But working from the top and working our way down, this has a really great example of the pediment, which is that triangular aspect. Remember that the Greeks developed the use of a truss system and the gabled roof, which is why you now have a need for a pediment, which is often highly decorated. Below the pediment, you have the cornice, which is a relatively slim piece of molding that just fits right below that pediment, but above the frieze. So the frieze falls right below the cornice and above the architrave. This would have also been another great place for a relief sculpture. And it is the center part of the entablature. So the lowest part of the entablature is that architrave. It usually would have been decorated with just molding and painted. So probably it wouldn't have a lot of relief sculpting in it, but it still would have been a means of decorating the building while enhancing the overall structure of the building. So below that, you have the capital of the column, the shaft of the column, and the base of the column. And then at the very bottom there, you have the stylobate, which is just the steps that would lead up to the building, basically. So the last slides showed you most of the vocabulary in terms of where everything fell, but this image here shows you all of the different places that detail would have been occurring. So in this top left corner, you can see somewhere where there's detail throughout, whereas down here in the middle, it's a little bit less ornate and busy. So this image here is of a caryatid, and a caryatid is a sculpted female figure used in the place of a column. This is not technically a part of any specific order, but it could have been paired with any of the orders that we have studied. And this was sometimes used in architecture, but you're going to find out it was most often used on furniture. So on this slide, you can see two of the optional features. So as we discussed, the base is standard in two of the orders, in the Ionic and the Corinthian orders, but the Doric order never would have used a base, so you're not going to see that paired with the Doric order really ever. And then the pedestal sits below the column, below the base of the column, and it may have been inscribed in some way as a signifier for either the building or a statue, similar to how we would use a pedestal today. On this slide, you can see an image of the portico. I believe this image is from the Parthenon recreation that's in Nashville. But the portico is just the porch that goes around the outside, the part in between where the columns would be and where the walls would be. This image here shows the decorative part of the lintel, which is often referred to as the frieze. As we've discussed before, all parts of the entablature can technically be decorated, but the frieze would have been by far the most common aspect to be carved into. On this slide, you see an image of relief carving, which would have been common in those architrave and entablature elements. Relief is a sculptural technique where the sculpted elements remain attached to a solid background of the same material. So you're really just removing excess of the stone in order to make these shapes in it, rather than carving out something completely, or which is also known as carving it in the round. Most everything we have talked about up to this point has been a public building because that's most of what we have left from Greece. However, the Greek houses weren't an elaborate affair in the same way that most of their other buildings were. They were actually pretty simple. There were many variations, but they were usually made from impermanent materials. So while Greeks did have access to high volumes of marble, they were also in a location that had a lot of trees. So unlike Egypt, they were able to use wood for their structures. All Greek houses were usually built around a centralized plan. As you can see here, they have courtyards, and all of the rooms kind of face inwards to a centralized space. And they were completely windowless to the outside, so the rooms always opened up to that courtyard, but they did not have any windows facing the street. Floors were sometimes paved with stone, but were usually just left bare. And then the men's quarters and the women's quarters were separated, which you can see very clearly on this floor plan. So where that letter D is, you can see a hallway that would have connected the two spaces, but for the most part, as you can see between spaces like 10 and 5, there would have been a clear separation in the house as to where the men would have stayed versus where the women would have stayed. To get natural lighting to the inside, they did use an atrium, so that would have been above the courtyard, and it would have been open to allow light in. And then they used a cloister as a means of protected circulation, so they did allow for airflow to come through. But most importantly, no matter the status of the inhabitants, the plan of the house was almost exactly the same. So remember that the Greeks didn't have this outward display of wealth. That wasn't what they really stood behind as a society. They were very protective of not allowing poverty in the same way that we see it in the world today. So no matter what the technical status of each person was, they all had a home that was very similar to this one that you see here. Moving on to furniture. So Greek furniture has generally not survived. So most of what we know because it was depicted on their pottery. So wood was the dominant material that was used, and it was characterized by elegance, not opulence, and never extravagance. And then the furniture was designed as a means of function. So everything was designed for the person using it in a means that would have made it simple for them to use. Seating and beds became popular items, and those were no longer limited to nobility. So most everyone in Greece had access to at least some forms of furniture. So some of the furniture that we will look at is the curule stool, which is very similar to the Egyptian stool, the klysmos chair, and this is probably the most important piece of furniture for you to be able to recognize from Greece, as it will be revived many, many times in history. It features splayed legs, concave back, and a stylobate. We'll see a picture of it later on, but that will be one of the most important for you to know. And then they did feature disc-turned legs, so this was a new form of carving that they were able to invent. And then the materials that they would use, you would see bronze, iron, marble, but most commonly wood. This slide here shows two different Greek beds. As you can imagine, they probably weren't the most comfortable, but they definitely served their purpose. So on the top image, you can see that turned leg, very similar to how we would see a turned leg today. So it would have been completely in the round, all matching. And then on the bottom image, you can see the klizmos leg, which once again is derived from that klizmos chair, and you can see that they kind of curve outward. So from where the center point of gravity is, they curve outwards towards the outside of that bed. This image here shows the curule stool, also known as an X stool. The X legs are what give this stool its name. They would have been fairly portable in comparison to some of the other chairs, which made them quite popular. But the X stool, it was very popular, and we will see it time and time again. Here is a drawing of the klizmos chair, and this is widely regarded as the most graceful, the most characteristic, and the most influential piece of Greek furniture. So like I said, we will see it revived time and time again. Unlike the X stool, which we saw previously, which had a lot of influence from Egypt, this is a purely Greek invention. So they weren't pulling outside influence in to make this. It was generally undecorated. The beauty comes from the form. So once again, remember that the Greeks really valued structure more than decoration, and that applied to their furniture as well. So it features that concave back, which would have been nice to sit in, more supportive than a standard straight back. And then it also has that famous klizmos leg, which, like I said, splays outward from that center of gravity. And then this one here features a stylobate, which is that step along the bottom, but that's not common of all klizmos chairs. Some would have had it, but some would have not had that. And then another thing about this chair, much like that X stool, is that it was lightweight, which made it easily transported. This image shows a modern recreation of the klizmos chair. So everything that we learned on the last slide still applies, and you can see the concave back as well as the klizmos leg. However, this one does not have that added stylobate. This is just one more image of a klizmos chair where you can see the concave back, and since someone's sitting in this chair, you can see that that does curve towards the back much better than a straight back chair would. And then you can also see the klizmos leg. So this slide details several different types of molding that the Greeks would have made popular. So starting with the top, you have a fascia, which is in architecture a molding whose section consists of a vertical flat surface, particularly the projecting crown molding of a cornice. So this is a pretty standard one that we still see quite a bit today, often known as the fascia board or just the fascia, however you choose to say that. Moving on to the scotia, this is a concave molding approximating a curve produced by two tangential curves of different radii. So we have an image of that down here in the lower right hand corner. But all of these, your vocabulary sheet will do a better job of breaking down. Moving on to the ovolo, This is a convex molding with a section approximating a quarter circle, which we'll find out is very, very similar to quarter round, which is the last thing on this list. A torus is a convex semicircular molding, which you can see just above the scotia. And then you have a dentil, which is a small square projecting block in a cornice, and it's part of a series in a molding. So this is the one that I talked about earlier. It gets its name because it looks like little teeth. A fillet is a molding whose section consists of a small vertical flat surface, usually at the start or finish of a curved molding. I'm not quite certain that there's a photo of that on here. That's the best example, but there's definitely one in your vocabulary notes, so just make sure you're looking over that. The cyma recta and cyma reversa are just S-shaped curves. Once again, there's not a great example on this page, but they are in your notes, and once you see them, they're very quick to recognize. They're just opposites of each other, so whichever way it curves in first or curves out first, either way they form an S-shaped curve. And then the quarter round is once again a convex molding in the shape of a quarter circle, so very similar to that of Volo. One of the main art forms that the Greeks are known for is their pottery, specifically their vases. To many, this is seen as one of the supreme achievements within the history of decorative arts. There were several kinds of vases, each of which had their own utilitarian purpose. As you see on this list here, there's a wide range of pottery within the Greek culture, each of which have been highly decorated. So as you can see here, all of these different items, which we'll look at in the next slide as well, have different purposes. So the hydria was used for carrying water, and then you would have a wine jug, and then one for oils, one for storing wine. So very different utilitarian purposes there. And there were two main kinds of decoration used for this pottery, black figure and red figure. We will see images of each of these in just a moment, but there's a really wide range of subjects that can be depicted on these. Sometimes it would show a story, sometimes it would tell you what that cup was used for. Like I said, it's a very, very wide range of subject matter. So on this slide, you can see several outlines of the different types of Greek vases, and they are all tagged down below so you can see which each of these would have corresponded to. And these were pretty uniform throughout, so if it was an amphora, which was vase A, and it was used for wine storage, they all would have had around that same shape. So the shape of the vase tells you what role it played. This slide here is showing an image of an amphora, which was used for storing wine, so it was much bigger than something that you would drink straight from. And this one is decorated in the black figure style, so you can tell that the figures, the main features, are done in black, and the negative space is that red. We'll see on the next slide, but that's going to be opposite of red figure, in which the negative space is black and the figures are red. So this is one of the two main styles, but this one specifically is the black figure style. So on this slide, you see an image of a volute crater, which was used for mixing wine and water. And then you also have an oenakoi, which was just a wine jug. This would have been more utilitarian in terms of pouring the wine. And as you can see here, just like I was mentioning on the last slide, the negative space on this vase is painted in black, which makes this a red figure vase. So this image here shows a kylix crater, which was used for mixing wine and water. And once again, you can see that this is done in the red figure style of decoration. Moving on to talk about the motifs that were popular in Greece, one thing to mention is that the Greeks really didn't use pattern very often, but they did develop a few graceful and mostly linear patterns that would become quite popular. Um, all of these here, at least the first three, are very much rooted in nature. So the acanthus leaf, which we've seen several times, mostly on top of those Corinthian columns, that is a really leaf-like pattern, obviously, very influenced by nature. You also have the honeysuckle flower and vine, as well as a stylized honeysuckle, also known as an enthymeme if it's in 2D and an antefix if it's in 3D. And then you have a fret pattern, which most of us will notice as a Greek key, and a guilloche, as well as the egg and dart pattern. So this image here shows the acanthus leaf pattern. As you can tell, it has a very scroll-like nature to it, while still obviously showcasing and focusing on those leaf-like patterns. So on the left side of this image, you can see the fretwork pattern, also known as a Greek key. And on the right side, you see the enthymeme patterns, which are a honeysuckle flower. They are in the 2D version here, so they are an enthymeme, as opposed to an antefix, which would be if they were in the 3-dimensional form. The fretwork is pretty influential throughout history. You'll see it time and time again. And it was intended to symbolize eternity. So if you follow the line, it should continue forever and ever. So that was important to the Greeks. While it is a very simple linear pattern, it did have more meaning to them than just beauty. This image here recalls the different types of moldings, which you can see on the far left. In the middle, you'll see the guilloche, which is a really rope-like pattern. Once again, very linear, though they are using curved lines here. And then on the right, you see the egg and dart. So all of these you'll see time and time again throughout history, specifically during Greek revival periods, but also a lot of these can still be found in historical American homes as well. So the egg and dart especially is quite popular. It's where you have the oval and then the little dart, and the oval and the little dart. This slide breaks down the difference between the enthymeme and the antefix. So once again, the enthymeme is if it is in a 2D form and the antefix is in a 3D form, but both of these represent a stylized version of the honeysuckle flower. This image here shows you several different types of patterning. So at the top, you can see that egg and dart pattern. Around the band in the middle, you can see the guilloche, or that rope-like pattern. You can see an enthymeme in that middle rectangle, as well as fretwork around the outside of that bottom half. So lastly, we have this image of several different types of assorted fretwork patterns. Once again, most of these were commonly referred to as the Greek key, and they're still pretty popular today. You see them on a lot of rugs and really anywhere where you want a simple pattern. So that's all we have for today. Make sure that you are reviewing your notes on this one, especially as all of these different orders and patternings we will see time and time again. So have a great day and good luck with the rest of your module.